The question I think that a lot of people in both leagues and sports in general are having now is, we're making all of this money in the short term, but are we going to pay some long-term consequences?
Hello, listeners. I'm Clarissa Moll. Welcome to the show. Joining me today are senior commentator Russell Moore. Hey, Russell.
Hello.
And senior commentator Mike Cosper. Hi, Mike.
Hey, hey.
And Isaac Rose-Berman, a fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men. Isaac, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this week, the U.S. grieved after a lone shooter entered a Manhattan office building, killing 4 people before turning the gun on himself. Media outlets report that the young man, a former high school football player, left a note criticizing the National Football League and asking that his brain be evaluated for CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative disease thought to be caused by repeated trauma to the brain through events like concussions. While evaluations are still outstanding, CTE can only be confirmed with autopsy. This event highlights the complicated nexus of healthcare concerns and profit margins within the NFL, a controversy that's only been amplified as states have legalized sports gambling in recent years, making the game even more profitable. Mike, for those of us who aren't big football fans, like me, help me understand why the shooter's claim of a CTE and his critique of the NFL matters.
Yeah, so this was an issue that maybe a decade ago really came into the mainstream in terms of just a sense of consciousness about what was going on. CTEs are essentially a CTE is essentially caused by repeated brain injuries, so multiple concussions. The more concussions you have, the more risk you have of getting a CTE down the line. Former players that, were known to have had CTEs, you can only confirm them through an autopsy. But players who were later confirmed to have had CTEs and have had, serious consequences as a result, essentially they start getting severe aging symptoms very, very early in terms of memory loss, confusion, impaired judgment. Players with CTEs have also complained of, profound depression, mood disorders, aggression, suicidal thoughts, all of this sort of thing. So yeah, it's a horrible injury. It's, in boxing, they would call this being punch drunk, after you'd done a 20-year boxing career. What happened about a decade ago was, this issue came into the mainstream and the league then began to implement a lot of changes. I mean, when I was growing up watching football, the highlight reels on ESPN every weekend were the nastiest hits, the ones that would send people, to the locker room and knock guys out and all of that. The rules have changed dramatically to where that sort of thing is, you get punished for it now. They've also done things to improve helmet technology and padding and various things to try to limit or eliminate concussions as much as possible. But football's a contact sport. So is boxing. So is mixed martial arts. So is hockey. And these injuries are going to continue so long as people are willing to take the risk to play the sport.
And I've had kids who play sports and have been injured in a game and they just want to shake it off and get back in there. But presumably, even an injured player benefits the organization financially, right?
Well, it can. I mean, this is a very complicated thing. But yeah, there are circumstances, where because of either salary cap rules or insurance policy rules or the ability to, the ability to make other kinds of roster changes and that kind of thing, there can be certain benefits of it. By the way, I have a child who got a concussion during a performance of Alice in Wonderland on stage. So it can happen anywhere, but I do think performing as Tweedledee is probably a lot safer than hockey. So.
Well, it sounds like there's already kind of a complex matrix as it relates to player safety and profit margins within the NFL. And then let's throw in another one here. We've got DraftKings. In 2018, sports betting became legal in the United States. As of last year, 38 states have legalized it. But folks have been betting on games for millennia. I'm sure there are some frescoes from the Middle Ages that show this kind of thing. Isaac, how does sports betting complicate the situation when it comes to players and the benefits to the organization?
Well, the NFL and other sports leagues are making a lot of money off of sports betting right now, whether it's via the advertisements that you see every time you run a game, the data that they're able to license and sell to operators, and revenue share agreements with these companies. But of course, when DraftKings and FanDuel are making money, people are losing money. And so the question I think that a lot of people in both leagues and sports in general are having now is, we're making all of this money in the short term, but are we going to pay some long-term consequences? You think about a kid growing up now, and are they an NFL fan or are they a DraftKings fan? And for the league, in the short run, that can be good. But if someone is not actually attached to a team and they're just attached to betting on that team, might not be so great in the long run, especially if, how sustainable is it that people are going to keep losing this much for that long? We've seen revenues from gambling go up so much so quickly. There's this big question of, is this really sustainable? And no one really knows the answer to that yet.
Russell, how have Christians traditionally viewed this kind of gambling?
Well, Christians have traditionally opposed gambling for a variety of reasons, some of them being early Christians, for instance, would reflect on the gambling that's happening over the cloak of Jesus at the foot of the cross, see this as an example of human depravity. Much later, though, and especially in American Christian life, there's been opposition to gambling that really merges the two sorts of sides of, for instance, the liberal fundamentalist sort of divide, which was often about the difference between whether our problems are fundamentally personal or social. And you could have both of those sides, both very concerned about gambling. The more conservative evangelicals concerned about the vice, the personal vice that happens with gambling. The more liberal Christians concerned about the social effect of what happens to families, what happens to communities, what happens with addiction. And part of that is a recognition of the kind of power that, for instance, casinos have. My first pastorate was in a casino town I grew up in, and I would have to deal often with people who you walk. I remember one situation walking into an apartment. There's only lawn furniture there because the husband had become addicted to gambling and had lost everything. There's no casino that's going out of business because of that, but he did. Now you add to that now the issue of smartphones. And you have two things happening. One is the same thing that we saw kind of with the move of porn from off the interstate video places to the ubiquity of the internet. But then you add to that the algorithmic push that happens when you're already addicted to smartphones. And then you add to it this immediate, seemingly immediate sort of dopamine rush. That brings a whole new level of complexity that Christians haven't faced before.
Isaac, you shared on your Substack that you placed your first bet at age 12, and you've been gambling on the internet since age 15. Talk to me a little bit about that power. What got you started and what kept you gambling in the years since?
Yeah, I mean, I placed my first bet with my grandfather. We were playing gin rummy, and we put some money on it. But I think I've been doing this a long time. I've been in this space for a while, and I think what Russell isolated, these sort of two parts. One is the newfound accessibility of it. So it's no longer that you have to go to a casino, but this is something that's always in your pocket. And two, the actual nature of the game, where, once it might have been man or woman versus vice, whereas now it's man or woman versus vice combined with billion-dollar companies with incredibly intelligent algorithms that are motivating you to place more bets and lose more money, and that becomes even more difficult to resist when you look at the ways that these companies are able to, for example, target losers, or if you are gambling daily on a site like DraftKings or FanDuel, and then you take a couple days off, it's very likely you're going to get a push notification saying, hey, come back now, your next bet is on us. And that's just a sort of an iteration of this vice that we haven't seen before, even though gambling has been around, obviously, for millennia. It's this new iteration that's really scary.
Yeah, it's far beyond the house always wins.
If you can imagine if there were some way to deliver alcohol by smartphone, you would have an entire group of people who are successfully recovering alcoholics right now because they know where not to go. I mean, I know people who would say, I can't go to that restaurant, I can't go to a liquor store, I can't go to these places, I can't go to a bar, but now are in a place where they can't escape. I mean, no one in this society can escape a smartphone at all.
And more than that, you can't escape the advertisements for gambling, right? Even if you were to give up your smartphone, you wouldn't be able to watch sports without being inundated with these ads. And I think when you think more broadly, the impact particularly on children, and obviously, when we talk about sports betting and gambling, this is generally a young men issue. The ubiquity of it. I used to go to baseball games with my father, and I was a big baseball fan. That's no longer possible without seeing DraftKings ads in the stadium. Or if you're listening to the commentator on ESPN, they're going to be talking about the betting lines. And in reality, if you're a 10-year-old there with your dad, he's probably placing bets on the game while you're not looking. So just the ubiquity of it, the inescapability of it, I think especially for young men, where they're growing up in a society where this is so normalized, and all they see is, LeBron James telling them that it's so cool to bet, and Kevin Hart saying sign up now, and there's really no pushback. And so one of the things that's been so notable with the expansion of gambling is the absence of sort of a religious pushback in a lot of instances, sort of from people who traditionally would be, on sort of the moral opposition side. And part of that is COVID, and this got legalized during COVID when there wasn't sort of the responses were lackadaisical for a variety of reasons. But I think we're sort of beginning to see that pushback now as people realize the consequences are devastating for so many.
Yeah, almost half of men ages 18 to 49, I read, have a sports betting account. Mike, does that number feel anecdotally accurate to you?
It does. I mean, I hear. I mean, I can say as well, like just among my friends, people I know at church, people I know outside of church, wherever. I would say most of my friends who are interested in sports are involved in online gaming in some form or another. For a lot of people, it's I set aside $25 a week and I just throw $5 bets here, $5 bets there. But then you find a lot of people who get really sucked into it. And look, I think one thing that's good for listeners to understand is if you've never gambled, especially if you've never gambled and won big, the addictive draw of that is something else. It's something extraordinary. Years and years ago, I was in my early 20s. I worked this job where I would get off work at noon every day, and there at the time you could go to Churchill Downs. This is where the Derby is. You could go to the Downs, and it was dollar days. $1 to get in, $1 hot dogs, and $2 minimum bets. And we'd just go over. I was working a coffee shop job. We'd just go over and gamble away our tips, and eat lunch and head out. And there was a day where we'd been doing this for a while, and I'd kind of figured out how to read a race card and understood what was sort of going on with the local trainers and everything. And I walked in one day with like $18 in tips, and I walked out with about $800 in my pocket. And I'll never forget getting in the car and looking at my friend and saying, I can never go back because I think I know what I'm doing now, and I will ruin my life, because that was the biggest rush I've ever experienced when that bet hit big. That can happen a few times on your phone, and then you're chasing that for until you've drained your bank account.
I mean, you know what it's true what they say, $1 won is twice as sweet as $1 earned. And to Mike's point, these companies want that. That's why you see, you'll see bonus offers where it's, no sweat bet, right? You lose your first bet, no problem, we'll give it back to you. And the whole point is to get people inculcated and to say, okay, you're going to win big early, and as Mike said, you're going to be chasing that forever.
Isaac, we've talked about younger men being particularly susceptible to this. Are there other populations who are significantly at risk for being sucked into sports betting?
Yeah, so sports betting is more of a male-dominated field, and in particularly when you talk about online and mobile sports betting, it's younger men because they're more likely to be on their phones. But when you talk about other kinds of gambling, it's actually a bit more split. So for example, you mentioned that sports betting is legal in 38 states now. Online casino games are legal in 7 states. And in the states where online casino is legal, we see it's much closer to 50-50. The biggest online casino customers are often middle-aged and older women. And it's generally because people gamble for sort of different reasons. As Mike outlined, men kind of want this rush, which often they get with sports betting, especially if they're sports fans, whereas women in general tend to gamble either out of boredom or sort of a desire to just sort of escapism. And so that's sort of the distribution there. But sports betting is mostly a male issue and mostly a young male issue.
That's interesting because I notice... I was not a person who was a customer at a casino, but I had to go in there pastorally and take some people out sometimes. Not take them out the way that sounded, but help them get back to their homes. And
Russ the mob hitman. I had to go into the casino and take them out.
One of the things that I noticed was that you would have the tables filled with men and the slot machines filled with old ladies.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, and that sort of gets to that exact point, whereas men sort of, they do want this rush, this excitement, whereas women in general, when they gamble, it's a more solitary activity. I mean, I think in particular when you think about slots, which now dominate the modern casino and the modern online casino, slots account for the vast majority of profits for these companies. And in a lot of places, you see casinos will take out, their craps tables, their blackjack tables, and replace them with slot machines because, to be clear, they're much more profitable. You don't have to have someone manning them. It's immediate. But one of the things you see when it comes to slots is just, the type of person who is on the slot is very different. And in reality, it's no different than Candy Crush, right? You think of the person who's playing games on their phone. That's the kind of person who's playing slots. And so, a lot of people will say, oh, why would you ever play slots? There's no appeal. And to me personally, there's no appeal. But we never hear people criticizing those playing games on their phone, and it's functionally the same thing. You're just adding a little bit of money to it. So, yeah, it's a tough issue.
So we have this big problem, clearly. Let's talk about solutions. Are there any kind of limitations that are currently in legislation or in process to create some limits for these apps that are so addictive and harmful to people?
Well, it is tricky, and I'll say just on that point, these apps are very addictive and harmful, but we should recognize that the vast majority of people, especially when it comes to something like sports betting, do engage in these products in a way that is not particularly dangerous to them. And so Mike mentioned, a lot of people are able to go on and, bet $5 at a time. There was a study that came out last year that, talking about the NFL, 60% of NFL bettors only accounted for 1% of sportsbook profits, meaning these are people who are really betting very, very small amounts. But at the same time, when you expose lots more people to these products, more people are going to face these devastating consequences. And of course, DraftKings and FanDuel are only able to be multi-billion-dollar companies because there are a few people losing a very, very large amount. When you go on and you place your $10 parlay, you're not making them lots and lots of money. They require people losing a lot. And so when you look at the distribution, it's something like 5% of users account for 85% of profits. And, some of those are going to be very, very wealthy people who can afford those losses. A lot of them aren't. So I think it's important to recognize that the consequences are really concentrated among those people who have serious problems. There are some things that are currently in motion, but nothing that looks likely to pass, and a lot of it is a state-by-state issue. There's not much federal legislation at the moment. There's one bill, the Safe Bet Act, which doesn't seem likely to pass in its current iteration, but really this is a state-by-state issue, and one of the problems there is that different states will have different regulations, different resources available, and so there are some states, for example, where online sports betting is legal, and there's like 4 or 5 addiction counselors in the whole state. Their hotlines are overwhelmed. Not that people are calling hotlines anymore, but there just aren't that many resources available, which is why it's a particularly sort of scary thing.
And probably the NFL is not interested, or Major League Sports in general are not interested in seeing any limitations as well.
Well, I think it's a complicated issue, right? I don't think anybody at the NFL wants people to get addicted to sports betting. But at the same time, they do want lots of revenue, and those things are sort of inextricably linked. So what you will see from a lot of leagues and even gambling companies is, what they call responsible gambling campaigns, where you'll see these ads. Every ad will end with the tagline, gamble responsibly, or they'll put out ads being, make sure you engage with these products safely. In reality, do those things actually dissuade people from gambling? Probably not. And to the extent that they do, presumably the leagues don't want it to dissuade them too much, because then they would make a lot less money. So it really is a complicated issue where I don't think there are, people will say gambling companies are evil. I get that to an extent, but I don't think the vast majority of the people there are evil people who want people's lives to be ruined. But it's almost just an inevitable consequence of the rapid expansion of these products, once again, particularly when they're available to you 24/7 on your phone, which, as you all know, we're all addicted to anyway.
Russell, that begs the question for me, is there any way to gamble responsibly? If I'm thinking beyond just me, myself, and I, but thinking about my neighbor as well.
Well, I don't think so, and partly because I think that we have a responsibility to, even if there's a small percentage of people who are drawn into addictive behavior, those people are disproportionately poor. You think about what happens with state lotteries, you think about what happens with the casino industry. So I think this is something that the church ought to talk about. And one of the reasons I think that doesn't happen is because people don't want to feel legalistic or fundamentalist. I mean, I know I do not know how to play cards, because in my family and in my church it would have been, the equivalent of putting on a Satan worshiping outfit to play cards. It's just not going to happen. And there are a lot of people who are trying to say, well, we don't want to be that legalistic, and so what they do is they don't talk about it at all. So you have this entire category of people's lives where there's no consideration happening at all as to what are the virtues that need to be cultivated, and what are our responsibilities to the vulnerable poor and to their families.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree with Russell completely. I will say that this is a battle that has been fought by Christians and Protestants historically in America, and it was lost, right? The reason that you probably don't hear so much is because those battles against state lotteries, against bingo, against casinos, these were battles that were lost. I'll give a shout out to my co-author who just wrote an article on titled "Where Are All of the Anti-Gambling Christians" in ARC magazine, and the point was that there were a lot of them, and then when they lost all of the battles against state lotteries because states wanted easy revenue, they said, okay, this is not a winning issue, so we're going to focus on other things, whether it's abortion or pornography or these other things where we might have wider support. I do think that is changing now, and you sort of have people realizing, wow, the consequences here are quite disastrous and very, very harmful. But when you ask why isn't it there, it's because these battles were fought and lost, and no one wants to keep going back and lose.
Well, and because you can't, in many cases, as somebody who's been part of some of these coalitions working against the gambling industry, they can outlast and outweight you. I mean, I think of
And outfund you, presumably, as
and
well.
outfund you. But I remember in my home state of Mississippi, we had these very careful regulations about where casinos could be on the water until Hurricane Katrina. And then the casino industry was able to say, after the state had become really dependent on that tax revenue, if you don't drop those regulations, we're leaving. And by that point, there was very little that could be done in a state that was just trying to recover. And so I mean, I don't think that we should become fatalistic about that. I mean, the tobacco industry was once completely unchallengeable and invulnerable, but you're right, it has been a tough going.
And no, I think you're exactly right. And so you think about sports betting, for example. It was decriminalized at the federal level in 2018, but it only really started spreading in a lot of states during COVID because there were so many budget problems in states. And then it was like, oh, this is a quick fix, we can get it. And that's what legalized gambling is. It's a way for state legislators and policymakers to get some money quickly without imposing additional taxes on people. It's sort of this voluntary tax, this sin tax, which is very politically popular. But in reality, when you look at the data, it's just not worth it. The revenue dissipates over time. As you mentioned, it's almost all from people who either have gambling problems or are in the bottom of the distribution. We feel the impact socially and financially down the road. When someone is addicted to gambling, not only is it horrible for them and their families and friends, but our healthcare system pays for it. They are now no longer at their job. All of these things, and so I think a lot of the issue is really building up this bulwark in advance, the resistance, so that when you have the inevitable budget crisis, then people are already conditioned to say, no, we don't want to just turn to legalized gambling as this quick fix. It's not actually going to work, but that's a lot easier said than done.
Mike, in preparation for this segment, I actually sat down and talked to my teenage sons about gambling. It was a conversation we hadn't had before because I didn't know that online sports betting was so prolific. And it was interesting because all of my rebuttals and all of my facts weren't all that compelling to a teenage boy. But I wonder if this might be an opportunity for the church. Major research studies tell us that boys' sports participation is declining, and this might seem dumb, but might there be an in for these boys who are young, who aren't compelled by facts, to get off the couch in their phones and actually start playing the games that they're betting on? Do we need men to show up relationally in the church for our sons, for these young men, 18 to 49, this group of young men who are particularly susceptible, show up in relationship to them and not just deliver the facts?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is always yes, but yes, I think that's the case here as well. I think part of what I find so disturbing about the rise of this is the normalization of it, and I think, again, as was pointed out, just a few minutes ago, what young men are mostly going to see are either people making small bets during games and just kind of having fun with it, and then they're going to hear when somebody hits big, right? Like you place a bet on on a series or something like that, and that comes back and hits big, or you make some, you can make these really strange bets these days where you're like, I think this quarterback is going to throw a touchdown to this receiver in this in this quarter of the game, and that kind of thing. And it's a high risk bet, but high reward. So they're going to hear those stories. They're going to see it in this very normalized way, because we're talking about money. And if someone loses, or if someone gets addicted, and there's dire financial consequences for them and their family, that's a shame thing. We don't tell those stories. People don't bring those things out. They're not as obviously discussed. So figuring out how we can tell stories, like the whole, the way our culture transitioned around drinking and driving, I think applies here. It took a lot of effort, a very concerted effort from groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving to get the word out, to get the word across that, hey, the consequences of this are dire, and people are dying, and people are suffering. Something similar, I think, needs to take place for something like this.
I completely agree with Mike. The normalization is huge. I think, Clarissa, one thing I would say for your sons is that they should understand that this is a rigged game. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't appreciate, in that you're not going to have young boys go tell their friends about this big slot win they had, because everybody recognizes that if you win big at a slot, it's all about luck. Whereas in sports betting, it taps into the male ego, and everybody wants to feel really smart. When you place that long shot parlay and you predict all of these things, you feel like a genius, and there's nothing better in the world than that feeling. But the reality is that these companies, if you are good at this, and to be clear, I think a lot of times people make the mistake of saying sports betting is just like all other forms of gambling, the house always wins. When in fact, that's actually not the case. It is possible to make money on sports betting, but the caveat there is if you know what you are doing, these companies will kick you out, right? And so, for example, I have gone to schools and talked to kids, and that's the message I give them, which is, look, if you are still able to bet, it's because these companies have deemed you to be a sucker, right? And you have to appeal to their ego and say, look, like you are not actually good at this, right? And that's what really worries me when you look at the surveys of young men, and it's something like 70 or 80% of them say either that I'm winning money or that I'm not losing money. And what we really need to do is combat this delusion, because as Mike said, not only are they going to tell your friends, if you go on social media, you think anybody is posting about their big losses? No, they're only going to post about their big wins. But if we make people understand that actually this is a rigged game, and you as an 11-year-old boy with your hunch about who your favorite quarterback is are no match for the $1 million algorithms and analysts these companies are employing, and even if theoretically you were really good at this, they would show you the door. The game is rigged, and so play if you want, but don't actually expect to win. And so that's all I'll say on that point. But if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'd love to talk to your sons.
Oh, thank you. I'd appreciate that. Well, Isaac, Russell, Mike, thank you for this conversation. So much to think about here. Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.